The iconic Woodstock Music and Art Festival of 1969 is celebrating its 50th anniversary this week. More than 400,000 people attended the event in Bethel, New York. The music festival is being relived this weekend at its original site, featuring 3 stages and more than 60 acts. Today's performers include Carlos Santana, The Killers, and Miley Cyrus. CBS Radio is celebrating the iconic festival's golden milestone with an hour-long special, Back to the Garden, to look at the 3 days of music that changed the world. CBS Radio correspondent Budd Mishkin is here now, and he's got a lot more on this special that CBS News Radio is going to be putting out there. So let's take it back to the beginning. How did this event start?
All right, there are 4 co-organizers. There are a million stories about Woodstock, and some of them line up, but the general understanding, we interviewed one of the co-organizers, Joel Rosenman, for the special, Back to the Garden, and what he says is he and his partner, John Roberts, business partners, young guys, had built a recording studio in New York. And they were visited by Artie Kornfeld and Michael Lang, who were interested in building a recording studio up in upstate New York, in Woodstock, where many musicians had gone to live, like Bob Dylan and the band. And what came out of that was an understanding or an appreciation that Joel and John, hey, we like this thought about if you do a party to open this recording studio in upstate New York, maybe some of the local talent will show up, local talent like Bob Dylan and the band. And from that small idea mushroomed the idea of doing a festival, and they were off and running.
How did people will look at the documentary that came out of Woodstock and certainly the music, but how did it go from just being the band and Bob Dylan to having all these iconic acts from Sha Na Na, which I always thought was hilarious, to Crosby, Stills and Nash, and of course Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Otis Redding, all these great bands and singers and performers. How did it go from just that small of an idea? Well,
there was a festival circuit at that point, and so it did have some momentum. In fact, one of the festival goers that we talked to, Mark Shearer, said he had been at the festival in Atlantic City in early August, and at the end of that festival they said, hey, we'll see you all in Woodstock. So between progressive rock radio, FM radio, which was really in its infancy at that point, but powerful and influential, also newspapers like the Village Voice, it started to get mentioned, and there was word of mouth, obviously long before the internet or cell phones.
Sure.
But they aimed big, and they went after Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Grateful Dead and the Who, and they eventually got all of them, but there were smaller acts as well. Sha Na Na is one of the great.
I love that story.
There's a million stories in there, and the Sha Na Na story is that they were all Columbia University students.
They weren't really a band,
and they were doing it for fun.
Yeah.
And they got a gig in New York earlier in 1968 at a club, and one night Jimi Hendrix shows up. Right? And they were pretty good.
Yeah.
Right? So they're doing their thing, and Hendrix says he brings other people in and eventually brings in the Woodstock producers, and they get signed on the spot. And not only that, but when they've gotten to Monday morning and they haven't played yet Sha Na Na, okay?
Yeah.
And they come out in their gold lame suits. This is like the age of Aquarius meets Grease. And Hendrix apparently said he was going to be last no matter what, and they wanted him to go, and he said, no, there are a couple of bands who haven't had their slot yet, including Sha Na Na. And so they pretty much owed their professional careers
to
Jimi Hendrix, and eventually they were in the film, which was very important.
Yeah.
And then they start going on tour across the world. They get a TV show, and they're off and running.
The rest is history. And there are so many other so interesting acts that played at Woodstock. The question is, when you look at we got a picture here, a graphic showing the thousands of people that came out. Young people will probably struggle to understand what this meant. There was no social media, there was no texting, there was no Snapchat, no Twitter. Word of mouth spread across the entire country, 300 million people.
So much so that we interviewed one festival goer who went to Cape Cod to pick up his best friend. He was going to school in Ohio, drives to Cape Cod, it's a pretty healthy drive, says to his friend, you got to come with me. And the friend says, I'm working on Cape Cod. It's a weekend. I can't leave my boss, in the lurch on a weekend in Cape Cod. So he leaves. Of course, that guy regretted that decision, for the rest of his life.
Right.
He leaves, picks up a hitchhiker on Cape Cod, and they just look at each other and say, Woodstock? Yep. And they're going. Other stories about what it meant. Jay Kernis, who's a producer here at CBS News, told me that he grew up in northern New Jersey, and folks, perfectly fine upbringing, but you were brought up to go to school and go to college and get a job and get married and have a family and have a house. And he shows up at Woodstock, and all of a sudden, maybe in a small North Jersey town or a small upstate New York town, the Beatles and the Stones, it was okay for them to have long hair.
Sure.
But if you were the one or two guys in a small town who had long hair, you were not so popular,
That's right? Yeah.
In 1969. And then to show up at a place where you see thousands of people that look like you and dress like you and love the same music, it had a powerful impact.
For me, I was born the year that Woodstock happened, but I think often, and I play the music many, many times, all those bands are bands that I grew up listening to. And there's always a sense that not only the music that was being produced that you saw on the stage, Richie Havens opening up with that Freedom, with Freedom, and Carlos Santana blowing folks away, Joe Cocker. There are so many iconic performances. A lot of people focus on Jimi Hendrix and the Star Spangled Banner, but there are so many iconic performances that came from that. And I always think that the music and the people who attended there really did have this ideal utopian vision for what this country could be, and so did the musicians, and that's what we saw sort of exhibited there.
Well, one word that kept on coming back to us through all these interviews with musicians, with festival goers, with organizers, with locals, and again, the people who created the festival, is the word kindness. Now imagine you're in Bethel, New York, small town in upstate New York, and all of a sudden, not just like 50,000 people are going to show up, but 400,000 show up, and there were a lot of people who were against it, a lot going in, and there are a lot of people who stayed against it for years after. Locals in Bethel. But there were also so many acts of kindness of people who were there. We focused on one place, Vassmer's General Store. American small towns all have a Vassmer's General Store, a place that kind of is the meeting place. And Vassmer's was known, amongst many other places, as the guys who ran it came out and gave out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to all these kids. The kids are here. You can either act with kindness or not. And many people acted with kindness. And they also talked about people who were there. And I spoke to the woman, the widow of the guy who ran the store, Marion Vassmer, who basically said, her husband never had a bad word about Woodstock. The kids were kind. They said please. They said thank you. Because who knows what they were imagining for 500,000 kids showing up. And they always say the kids.
Yeah, they thought it was going to be Marlon Brando and the Wild One,
right,
biker gangs. Yeah.
And so much so that Marion Vassmer, her granddaughter actually, Heather Brown, tells the story of at the 30th reunion, a guy shows up at Vassmer's store, which doesn't exist anymore, but did then, and says, "Where's Mr. Woodstock?" Meaning the man who ran the store, and they had to say he died a few years ago. And the guy hands the granddaughter, $50. Says, "Your grandfather gave me $10 that weekend for food, and I'm paying it back with interest," with tears in his eyes. And so those are the types of stories. In terms of the greater truth, we'll get that. And everybody has their greater truth about what it meant. But in this documentary, Back to the Garden, which is on CBS News radio stations around the country and on SoundCloud and on the CBS News Radio app, we looked for stories. And those types of little stories kind of filled it in for us in terms of what it meant for people and what they best remembered from that weekend.
Budd Mishkin, thank you very much for sharing this with us. It's really cool.
My pleasure.